Hi everyone, in today's video I'd like to share with you some pepper growing experiments we've been performing this season. This year we're growing 200 pepper plants in 7 different ways, and I thought I would share with you some of the successes and some of the failures. Every year here in our homestead we usually grow about 100 pepper plants, primarily inside this 12-foot by 16-foot scrapwood greenhouse that we built for a little over $200. We grow all of them in black plastic buckets, and we've been very successful growing this way. So a few years ago, we decided to build another small greenhouse inside the forest garden project under the shade of a wild pear tree. Because this greenhouse was going to be shaded for most of the morning, we decided to remove the plastic, leaving it on only early in the season when the temperatures are low to protect our young pepper plants, and later in the season to extend the growing season, so we can still be harvesting peppers well into November. Although we've been successful growing in our greenhouses, we wanted to try other ways of growing our peppers, but because we're growing in an area with a lot of deer pressure, any method we use has to be animal-proof. So we decided to try growing peppers in some boxes that we built out of scrap wood, and we also planted some in this test garden in a wild section of grapevines next to the large wooden boxes we built to experiment with new ways of growing tomatoes. We also decided to plant some in raised beds outside of our primary pepper house, and planted some in the new experimental greenhouse under the shade of our pole bean roof. And lastly, we planted some in a section of our forest garden project under the shade of grapevines and red raspberry plants. So we've grown peppers this season 7 different ways, all with their own challenges. For some, it was planting them right in the middle of a field where the deer and other animals are most likely to eat them, and for others, it was planting them where they would receive limited sunlight. All were planted with one thought in mind: what is possible and not possible when pushing the limits when growing peppers. What was most successful, what was a failure, and why. So I'll start by showing you why growing in plastic buckets in this greenhouse has been so successful. Although this little greenhouse is not in full sun all day, it provides just enough for them to grow and produce well. Because of the way it's situated, it receives light in the morning and then shade later in the day. Often, growers who grow peppers in greenhouses need to use shade cloths, but we're taking advantage of the shade provided by nearby trees. The combination of the perfect amount of light in growing in buckets, so we can control water and nutrients, has allowed us to produce more than enough peppers to eat fresh and to preserve. This greenhouse we built inside our forest garden project has been a little more of a challenge because it was built under the shade of a wild pear tree. The plants do not receive light until about noon, so they're actually receiving sunlight during the hottest part of the day. The challenge here has been to keep them well watered, especially early in the season when we're experiencing a drought and multiple heat waves. Another challenge was because we had a very cold spring, we were a little late getting these plants in the greenhouse. Even with the plastic on, it was still too cold, and we didn't want them to become stunted. But despite all the earlier challenges, the pepper plants are doing very well. They've recovered from the heat wave damage when they were dropping a lot of their flowers, and the flowers that didn't drop are producing peppers. So we expect to get a great harvest from these 30 plants, and we definitely plan to keep growing peppers here in the forest garden greenhouse. Now, growing in this location was a definite leap of faith. We built these boxes right in a field where the deer graze and sleep, but I thought if I built these boxes a small enough size so they couldn't jump in them, and then covered each of them with deer netting stapled to the sides, it should work, and it did. All they're able to do is walk around them, but they can't get to the plants inside of them. So these boxes measure 39 inches by 39 inches, and there are 6 plants inside each box. We've been harvesting lots of huge jalapeno peppers, and although the habanero peppers in another box are not fully ripe, there are a lot of them. And in this box are sweet bell pepper plants that are doing well, despite the fact that I allowed some volunteer tomato plants to grow in them. All of the plants are producing well, and I expect to harvest a good amount of peppers from these 6 plants. So if you're dealing with having to grow in a very small space and don't want to grow in buckets, building and growing in these small beehive-shaped boxes may be a good option. Also, I should add that during the heat waves and drought, the plants in these boxes did very well. The sides of the boxes provided some shade, and they were one of the planting methods that required the least amount of water. So now for one of the more unexpected ways to grow peppers. Last season, this space, although located in our forest garden, was a lot more restrained. We were growing tomatoes in 2 long rows in the middle of the inner garden, with grapevines growing up the inner fence line and raspberry plants growing along one side of the outside of the inner fence. But all that changed this season when it was obvious the raspberry plants had made other plans. This spring we removed about 24 raspberry plants, potted them up, and moved them to another location. But they just kept encroaching, so we decided why fight it this season? So we just decided to go with it and let the wildness prevail. So here in the shade of the grapevines above, and mingled with the raspberry plants below, we planted 1 row of tomatoes, about 20 Black Beauty eggplant plants, and sandwiched between them we planted 16 pepper plants of both hot and sweet varieties, leaving 2 small paths to walk to access and care for the plants. And growing peppers like this has been working surprisingly well. They receive early morning light, are shaded during the hottest part of the day, and receive ample light from late afternoon until sunset. They require little water due to being shaded during the hottest hours, and are producing very well. We've decided that we'll definitely be growing peppers in here again next season, because we are trying to make moves toward growing more in a forest garden type setting. Then we tried growing peppers in the shade outside the primary pepper growing greenhouse. We knew we would not be as successful as in other locations, but we wanted to do an experiment. We realized some of our viewers may not live in a location where there's ample sunlight. Maybe you live in an apartment and have to grow peppers near a large window, and diffuse or dappled light is all you have to grow in. So we picked this shaded spot to duplicate what some viewers may be experiencing, just to see if the pepper plants would produce any peppers at all, and surprisingly we did manage to produce a few peppers, but it was only the cayenne and jalapeno pepper plants that managed to produce peppers. Then we planted some pepper plants in this new greenhouse we built with a living roof. The roof is presently purple pole bean vines, and it is somewhat shaded to heavily shaded depending on the time of day. We've managed to grow some peppers here too, but not very many. We just wanted to see what would happen if we increased the light slightly. We grew less peppers on the sides of the greenhouse than in the middle, where there's more light coming in due to a gap in the vines. And then because we had about 10 pepper plants left to plant, we really decided to get creative. We had built some boxes for a tomato experiment, and there's a patch next to them where the grapevines have spilled over the fence and are becoming wild. So we decided to create a little wild garden, where we're growing some squash plants in a few buckets, and decided to plant some pepper plants among the wild grapevines to see what would happen. We didn't have very high expectations for the outcome, but because we'll eventually be turning some of our gardens into forest gardens, this was an important experiment. Every experiment we perform and outcome we observe benefits us when we decide to make the change. Although the pepper plants are planted in full sun, the grapevines constantly threaten to swallow them up, and we had to pull the vines off of them. Lesson learned: grapevines left unchecked will devour everything in their path. So next season we'll be taming the grapevines and building a few more of these boxes to grow peppers in. The boxes are in full sun and our pepper plants will be protected from hungry deer and other animals, so building and growing in the boxes should work well. We really enjoyed experimenting with different ways of growing our pepper plants this year, and we hope you enjoyed this video and that maybe it inspires you to try experimenting with different ways of growing your peppers.